once again, has been expertly organized by Amitabha Chaudhry. This year's theme, loosely, is the African Atlantic. Some talks a bit more than others, but you'll see that as a theme throughout the year, also with next week's talk by Christopher Brown. But today we have a talk by Matt. Matt is currently Professor of Africana Studies and American Studies at Brown University. He is also Chair of American Studies, which means that he can herd cats with ease and also explain to a senior colleague why there will be no full-size refrigerator outside of her office door. I don't know how well that's gone, but there's still no refrigerator there. Before he went to Brown in 2012, he was Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana and founding chair of IU's American Studies Department. For his work there, he won some fancy pants award from the American Studies Association. Just some award. And before that, he was at Washington State University. And even before that, he was a graduate student at Rutgers, where he and I met in a dingy lounge, a very dingy lounge, at Rutgers Newark an alarmingly long time ago. I walked into the room, I was about to go TA, I think, and some guy I'd never seen before asked, rather abruptly, I might add, "What do you work on?" And he actually cared. He always does, though. And just ask any of his colleagues that he shepherded through the tenure process, or any of the deans he's weaseled money out of for his departments and his colleagues. In addition to chairing departments and hanging out in dingy lounges with me, Matt has also published a whack of books and articles that consider race and nation, often, though, as we'll see today, not always, within the broad parameters of the United States. The Color of Race in America, 1900 to 1940. American Mediterranean, Southern Slaveholders in the Age of Emancipation. Seeing Race in Modern America. Josephine Baker and the Rainbow Tribe. Along with a book called Hotel Life, written with Carolyn Levander from Rice, a book I know which required very difficult fieldwork. And an edited collection, Race, Nation, and Empire in American History, co-edited with James Campbell and Bob Lee. In the interest of time, I will not list all of his articles. You can look them up. He's currently got 2 books underway and under contract: Faking It, Cross-Dressing, Passing, and the Making of Race, Class, and Gender in American History. That door doesn't work. It's just there to trick you. And Roger Casement, a biography. And today we're going to hear a bit of the Roger Casement project. Matt.
First, let me make sure the microphone is on. Yeah, cool. And then I just want to thank Diane and Matt here at Amitabha, who organized this, for making it possible to be here safely, to get here on time, to enjoy the splendors of tiny planes with propellers. And I want to acknowledge that today is the first time I'm getting older. You wouldn't have noticed that, though. Roseanne would have noticed that. And today is the first time I printed up something in 16-point font and found that it wasn't big enough. So I don't understand what's happening to my body. And I'll just, if I'm a little stuttered or stuttery here, please forgive me. And lastly, I just have to say, I had promised myself, and I know I mentioned this at breakfast, that I would spend the last hour in the library preparing for the talk. But the truth is, I've been transfixed by what's going on in Washington, D.C. And it's an odd moment for me to be giving a talk about the cruelty of the state and the history of sexuality, given what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now. So I want you to know that there's a part of me that has all the feelings right now, as the kid says. And we'll see how this happens. So I'm trying to close out a biography, broadly construed, of Roger Casement, the Irish nationalist and progressive muckraker, the agent of empire and the anti-imperialist, the champion of the brutalized downtrodden at the margins of the known world, and the queer sex tourist with a preference for poor, marginalized lovers. A quick primer for those of you who've never heard of him before. Roger Casement, an Irishman, had been a British consular agent in the aftermath of the so-called scramble for Africa. Dispatched to investigate gruesome rumors, he surveyed the abuses of Leopold's Congo and laid them bare for public scrutiny, and later publicized the plight of Peruvian indigenes and British subjects in South America. This work led to his knighthood, but beneath the surface it also nurtured his radicalism. as he came to resent and then actively work against the corporate and imperial exploitation of the global South. There was a deeper logic to this political awakening too, seeing himself as part of an unhappily subject race. He'd sympathized with the underdog in the Boer War, committed himself to the radical cultural nationalism of the Gaelic League, and sojourned to America to fundraise for Irish Revolution. He was committed, in other words, to what we might now call, looking backwards, the human rights struggle, if strangely refracted through Irish history. In the middle of the Great War, Casement had attempted to organize a brigade of Irish soldiers recruited from captured POWs in Berlin, and then tried to smuggle weapons into Ireland. Caught when his vessel foundered on the Irish coast, he was arrested just a few days before the Easter Rising of 1916, a failed attempt to free what he'd come to see as Britain's last white colony. Spared a military execution, he was granted a splashy trial and a failed appeal, and then was executed by hanging in August of that same year. There are at least a dozen Casement biographies, more than that if you count the highly partisan texts that also masquerade as official lives. Partisan texts that draft in the wake of his afterlife, and that weigh in on the various conspiracies that emerged after his execution. And there's considerable material evidence in Dublin, London, and New York, along with a smaller fugitive collection here or there. And I've come to realize as I move through all of this, that there are at least two ways to end the life of Roger Casement, two ways to close out a narrative this melodramatic. The first, which I'm not really going to talk too much about today, but I wanted to be on your mind, is to think of the radical political possibilities that snap into sharper focus when Casement's life is seen as a backdrop. I'm thinking specifically of the potent Black Irish connections ranging from Frederick Douglass's tours to Ireland after his self-emancipation to Roddy Doyle's narrative of the hardscrabble band The Commitments, so desperate to feel and express the alienation that comes from soul music. I'm thinking of the green stripe on the pants of the Garveyite uniforms. I'm thinking of Casement and Du Bois circling each other at the Universal Races Congress, two of the world's best-known radical critics at the time of white world supremacy and empire. I'm remembering those across the diaspora who saw in Casement, in the summer of his trial and eventual execution, a lonely advocate for colonial reform, if not revolution, an agitator who saved Black lives at a moment of global crisis. I'm thinking finally of Casement's profile on a mural wall on the Shankill Road, right next to a portrait of Frederick Douglass. The second way to close out this life is the subject of this afternoon's talk. And here today I want to think about the British state's effort to define Casement's sexuality, to clarify it for the archive, and also to bury it. What, I wonder, was that all about? How precisely does it link up with the larger human rights struggle, the struggle that bound together Black and Irish actors, and that I see as another logical endpoint? Skipping. The letter began matter-of-factly. It was dated August 3rd, 1916, and addressed to Sir Herbert Smalley, the Medical Commissioner of Prisons in the Home Office. The brief missive had been composed by Dr. Percy Mander, the medical officer in London's mundane Pentonville prison. Mander wrote straightforwardly, "I made the examination after the conclusion of the inquest. Throughout the letter had a perfunctory quality, as if it were written to satisfy the expressed interests of a superior, as if it were merely about the verification of a single obscure fact." Indeed, Smalley, a social scientist at heart who'd already conducted comparative studies of suicides in prisons, had spoken with Mander at the Home Office earlier that week, pulling aside his subordinate to ask for his opinion on one of the most pressing questions of the day. Was Roger Casement, the soon-to-be executed treasonous thorn in the side of the crown, a practicing homosexual? The man's queer past had already been litigated behind the scenes over the course of that dramatic, contentious summer. Only a few months earlier, in preparation for the armed rebellion planned for the Easter holiday by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, Casement had tried to smuggle weapons, antique German guns, decades old and hardly worth the effort, into Ireland. The British had preemptively been tracking his movements. He was easily caught, and the collection of evidence for trial began almost right away. And then, only a few days after his arrest, Dublin became a war zone as armed radicals and would-be revolutionaries seized public buildings and tried to free their country. From that point, Everything played out in Shakespearean fashion, with the military demolition of the fledgling resistance to British rule mirroring Casement's declining legal fortunes. Found in a set of London trunks, Casement's confiscated possessions included diaries that carefully chronicled a lifetime abroad, diaries that also revealed his queer sexual practice, his preference for working class and indigenous brown-skinned young men. There were, a working group convened in 1959 noted, 5 diaries: a small field service pocketbook from 1901, a pocket diary and almanac from 1903, office and desk diaries from 1910 and 1911, and a ledger from 1911. These 5 palm-sized diaries ranged across Casement's political work in the Congo and Putumayo. As authorities saw it, when laid out in this sequence, the diaries reflected a pattern of moral decay. The earlier diaries from the Congo contained a few entries indicating his homosexual proclivities, quote, close quote, but the bulk of their entries were quotidian and pedestrian. The later diaries from the Putumayo chapter of Casement's life were structurally different. Both diaries, the report went on, contained indecent material interspersed among normal entries, that for 1911 in greater quantity than for 1910. This leaves no doubt, the assessment ran, that Casement was becoming increasingly obsessed with this perversion. The ledger, or cash book as it was called elsewhere in the records, is principally devoted to notes of personal expenditure, but also contains notes about homosexual activities and payments made to homosexual partners. Surveying this very private index of the closet, the Home Office had concluded that Casement was sliding into the abyss. In the implicit tone, both in 1916, when he was on trial, and in 1959, when they wrote this history as a way to figure out what to do with the diaries, the implicit tone was one of profound self-congratulation, as if the execution of a treasoned sexual predator could clip off vile practices that would only have worsened had he been allowed to live. Casement was convicted of political crimes against the Crown, but to destroy the reputation of a man they feared, British authorities circulated copies of the pages from the diaries within the government and leaked news of their scandalous content. The unofficial rumors ensured that critical allies remained silent, that the chorus of voices that might have been raised on his behalf was muted. By midsummer, Casement had been stripped of his knighthood, had exhausted his legal appeals, and stood facing his executioner alone, without even a lawyer present. Major newspapers had turned against Congo Casement, and longtime friends and colleagues had shunned them. Herbert Smalley was interested in a simple, inelegant verification. Was Casement a practicing homosexual? It's interesting that he even wondered. After all, the British authorities had Casement's private diaries written in his own hand, rich with details of sexual transactions and illicit affairs, all with men, and were confident enough in the veracity of those diaries to deploy them backstage during the trial. Still, the question lingered. The diaries would never be able to stand on their own, not in London, and perhaps not in the court of public opinion. There was a very narrow window in which Casement's body might be used to corroborate what had been discovered in the diaries. So the actuarially inclined Smalley prompted his staffer to see if any of the rumors could be confirmed, physically that is, through an examination of Casement's body. Beyond the advent of social scientific inquiry, hundreds of years of history lay behind that question, and behind Mander's clinical answer to it. This kind of intrusive medical examination to determine sexual deviance dated back to the mid-18th century in Europe, where it was used randomly, and quite typically not on a corpse, to identify bodies predisposed by nature to various sorts of perversion. In the early 19th century, at a time in England when the Buggery Act allowed men who had sex with men to be executed as sodomites, expertise continued to dwell on the phantasmagoric signs of sin, physical indications of inner deviance. Across the whole of the 19th century, though, the relationship between the evidence of the body and the danger of crime remained dynamic and imprecise. And between 1835, when the last 2 sodomites were hung, and 1916, explanations for queer practices slowly shifted away from the body and towards the mind and towards human psychology. By the time of Percy Mander's post-mortem inspection of Casement's corpse, the sexual phantasmagoric had been largely transformed to black and brown skin. The anatomical proof of deviance transmuted into the more modern, durable structures of race. Lodged there, they would shape racial sight and policing strategies right up to the present. But in London, in that summer of 1916, the old anachronistic habits of discernment were still thought to be the best, or at least the most useful when it came to understanding Roger Casement. It's tempting to not make much of this examination, to just allow it to be a reflection of Mander's strange clinical interests, or to see it as more proof that the English were out to rip up Casement's already ragged reputation. Tempting in part because there was no regular inspection like this for the average man arrested on charge of buggery or sex between men. This is certainly at least partly true, but Mander's report was also buried in a file for generations, not splashed on the front page of a newspaper and not released to the public until 1995. Casement's diaries were hidden away as well. Hidden away from the daylight, those fragments of evidence served a different purpose. Whatever the British authorities hoped to discover, they never really planned to share it with the world. Mander, for one, was quite certain about what he'd found. His handwriting was tiny, precise, and officious, and the ink from his fountain pen gathered in the retreats and pauses of each letter. He'd examined Casement's body in the prison doctor's office and had found unmistakable evidence of the practices to which it was alleged the prisoner in question had been addicted. Surveilling the corpse face down on a prison medical table, Mander found that the anus was at first glance seen to be dilated. Donning rubber gloves, he performed a digital inspection, determining that the lower part of the bowel was dilated as far as the finger could reach. And then, almost as an afterthought, he included the summary details of the execution. The vertebrae were completely severed and the spinal cord also, so that death was absolutely instantaneous. There was some satisfaction here in the letter, that the execution of Casement had gone without a hitch. The prisoner, he concluded, was dead in 40 seconds from leaving the cell. Once the rumors had been medically confirmed, the authorities had no more use for Casement's physical remains. They threw his naked corpse into an open grave in a prison yard and applied quicklime, an ancient post-mortem punishment for history's greatest villains, long reputed to melt the flesh and dissolve the bones. There would be no casket, no gravestone, no chance of a martyr's shrine, only the anonymity of a mass grave and the presumably slow dissolve of bones and flesh. Years later, when his remains were excavated for repatriation back to Ireland, they would need to sift through the bodies or corpses of 2 convicted murderers to find all that was left of one of the most dangerous men in 20th century world history. Now, the scholarly stakes for Irish historiography are clear, and I say this recognizing that I'm an Americanist and that it takes some hubris to say those things out loud. As rumors of the diary spread, Irish opinion was split, with half of the public accepting their legitimacy and the other half clinging to the conspiratorial notion that they must have been forged. In the former case, wrestling with Casement's homosexuality became a way for the nation to litigate its own deeply Catholic history, to either trouble or confirm the mythos of 1916 as a romantic, masculine awakening. And for a long time, and to still today to some extent, for those who believed he was gay, Casement was simply set outside of the history of 1916. Debating the legitimacy of the diaries, in contrast, proved to be more intoxicating. It left the door open to villainize the British, to accuse them of doctoring private journals, making it possible to offload homophobia onto a brutal imperial power. Casement wasn't queer, the other argument went. The British just make him look that way, and shouldn't they be damned for it? Very few people had even seen the diary in the early years. As Ireland struggled through civil war and its aftermath, the larger public was left to use rumor and myth and stereotype to make sense of Casement, and the sexuality of his public image was often scrupulously policed by friends and family in the absence of the diaries. In early 1922, as the nation began to publish brief and tame excerpts from Casement's Berlin diary, a female letter writer dispatched some verse that he'd inscribed into an album in 1907. Sir Roger, the correspondent noted, was in those days looked upon more as a dreamer and a poet than anything else. He was exceedingly picturesque. His real gray-blue Irish eyes, thick dark hair and beard, and tall manly figure always attracting attention, and his charm of manner winning him many friends. Documenting Casement's celebrity, she envisioned him as a lady killer, as someone who knew well how to fascinate the opposite sex, and who was more popular with women than with men. Agnes Newman, Casement's sister, would have none of it. Responding to the notion that Casement was a lady killer, she argued nothing could be further from the truth. No man, she continued, had a greater detestation of that unmanly creature, lady killer, than Roger. And he was too busy at all times, both at home and abroad, to trouble his head concerning women, good, bad, or indifferent. Newman testified that she had a vivid recollection of very determined advances made by members of the opposite sex toward him, and also of his very brisk rejection. I utterly deny that he was more popular with women than with men. Casement, Newman thought, was no lady killer, but was surely a manly example of the very best of Ireland. For Newman, a saintly, chaste Casement was much easier to champion than a queer Casement. So I accept the diaries as legitimate because I see no reason to trouble radical political work by limiting it to straight men and women. But having said that, the stakes here in Casement's life through world and global and transnational history are a bit unclear. So what are the implications for the histories of empire, human rights, of race and nation? What makes a person awaken to the problems of the poor, the dark-skinned, the abused when they seem so very far removed? What larger cultural changes were afoot in Europe and the world? Where does idealism come from? How does such idealism become radicalized? What's the relationship between histories of radicalism and idealism and histories of sexuality? These are the challenges of this book, the one that I think apparently won't write itself. To make sense of the political work of white, queer, Irish world travelers, to chronicle the experiences of one man, an agent and an antagonist, working with increasing conviction to illuminate the failures of imperialism, a closeted gay man standing in as representative of empire's moral conscience, a man who was both famous and increasingly infamous. So infamy, as I'm using it here today, is an elusive concept borrowed from Michel Foucault, a scholar of social and intellectual systems, who had a particular interest in things that were difficult to describe or name or define. And in the power relations that were revealed by the study of these sorts of phenomena. Thinking of Casement, I recall that Foucault saw out moments when certain people were erased from history, while others were suddenly spotlighted for the world's eye. For him, power was best uncovered at the edge of knowledge, the white-hot point of contact between social understanding and sudden erasure. As a consequence, Foucault's work focused on the lives of ordinary folks who were suddenly brightly lit for all the world to see, and then just as suddenly found themselves on a darkened and dismantled stage. Fame and infamy, he argued, are best understood as very different things, as opposites even. Over the course of his trial and execution, Casement joined the ranks of the most famous criminals of the 19th and early 20th century. Not merely Oscar Wilde, whose trial loomed like a shadow over Casement's fate, but other sensational trials of murderers and thieves and scoundrels. Troubling our vocabularies, Foucault would ask us to see these criminals as famous, not infamous. Apparently infamous, he wrote, they're in fact men of glorious legend, even if the reasons for this renown are the inverse of those which make or should make for the grandeur of men. Their infamy is only a modality of universal fame. In life, Casement had earned this sort of celebrity twice over. Proper infamy, Foucault closed, compounds no kind of glory. If Casement were truly infamous, Foucault might clarify, anyone who encountered his name might simply shrug, evincing a sheer indifference or lack of recognition. It's hard to turn fame into infamy, though the British government tried. And governments generally do not always do well when it comes to erasing the past. Infamy takes time and effort and determination. Infamy, on Foucault's terms, is erasure and forgetting, the blotting out of public memory. Casement was a glorified hero, his reputation rich and technicolored, an incorruptible man whose name had stood until the summer of his trial for something good and decent. His burial, his naked body covered in quicklime, tangled with common criminals, their names lost to history, was the start of a state-sponsored effort to destroy his fame, to take away the very memory of what he had done, whether good or bad, to make him once more infamous. The diaries were central to this effort. and they have a weird history of their own. Remember, or know, if you don't remember me saying it, remember or know that for much of the summer of 1916, rumors about the diaries and the typescript copies of the diaries circulated illicitly. The day after the court's decision, the Daily expressed reference to the diaries and their troublesome content. The Home Office shared extracts from the diaries with two alienists who were asked to express an opinion on the mental condition they disclosed, largely because the Home Secretary was considering a reprieve on the grounds of insanity. And then a memorandum about the diaries was circulated to the cabinet, arguing that they should be used after his execution to prevent opinion in the United States making a martyr of him. It appears that information about them circulated across the Atlantic. Once Casement's appeal was dismissed and the possibility of a reprieve was set aside, those same typescript copies of the diaries were used to tamp down diplomatic and domestic pressure. A friend of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who'd been lobbying on Casement's behalf, was shown the typescripts. So too was the U.S. ambassador, who'd apparently heard rumors and wanted them confirmed. A prominent Irish American was shown photographs of two passages, which was apparently enough. Cables from across the Atlantic suggested that the British Embassy in the United States had either copies or extracts from the diaries, which it was liberally sharing to warn politicians and the church against running Casement as a martyr. Circulated backstage by the Home Office, even offered to the defense as possible evidence in support of an insanity plea, they still existed in a kind of nebulous space. Marked on the list of Casement's belongings as unreturned, they remained in control of the Metropolitan Police after execution until 1925. The police were supposed to keep them locked up. They proved unable or unwilling to keep the clutch of notebooks and folios safely hidden away. These earlier circulations could not be so easily stopped. In one internal memorandum marked as urgent, we learned that one day the diary of Roger Casement simply could not be found. The commissioner in turn had directed an internal inquiry asking for a complete statement of the circumstances in which this diary had been lost and had now found itself back again in the possession of the police, and of methods adopted for its safe custody. 3 days later, a handwritten note indicated that they were locked up in his safe rather than where they'd been prior. The police's sloppy handling of the diaries made an emergency policy of silence and forgetting difficult to maintain. Later on in 1922, the same typescript copies that had circulated in the Home Office had fallen into the hands of, or were delivered by a British agent, the hands of an eager journalist, Peter Singleton Gates, who after receiving them from this vagabond agent, bandied them about like they were hidden treasure, trying to publish them both in the US and in France to avoid various acts. At that point, as a consequence of the spectacular failure of the Metropolitan Police, the diaries were removed to the control of the Home Office. And the Home Office itself clammed up for the next 4 decades, not merely locking up the diaries, but refusing to admit that the public that it existed in the first place. Families, friends, and other interested parties with intimate knowledge had tried for decades to pry them loose. Casement's attorney, Sergeant Sullivan, had labored to retrieve them from the government after the execution but failed. Gertrude Parry, his sister, had tried in 1922 with no luck. And then in 1924, she secured a promise from then Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, a promise that the diary should never be opened except by the express order of the Prime Minister of the day. That promise was not renewed, of course. The Prime Minister who followed MacDonald into office, Conservative Party leader Stanley Baldwin, just simply ignored the agreement completely. But I find it telling that Gertrude Parry, Casement's last confidant, had sought to extract the promise from the British government that they would keep the contents of the diary in strict secrecy as well. And I'm aware that family and friends might well be complicit in what the state subsequently did. The Home Office kept its secrets well, but that didn't lead the public to stop talking about Casement's sexuality. In the absence of information, of course, disinformation will do. In the decades that followed, falsehoods circulated with the authority of truth. When it came to the diaries, to be pro-Casement meant that one dwelled in the fever swamps of conspiracy, embracing an often elaborate theory built of 1,000 moving parts, a theory about the British production or revision of the diaries during Casement's trial, which was meant to soil his reputation, that, for instance, a British forger had added or interpolated all of the sexual details into a diary originally written by Casement, or that Casement's most vexing journal, the so-called Black Diary, was merely his effort to transcribe the words of Armando Normand, the slave driver of the Putumayo, for the historical record, or that other diaries had gone lost and missing, diaries that might contradict the diaries held by the British. The very idea of the diaries themselves was, in a way, always rich with legal ambiguity. When they were casements, they were intimate ledgers and notebooks, private things rich with personal meaning. And then, quite suddenly, they became something else, neither fully private nor fully public. They were unspecified on the one hand, discovered in connection with a criminal trial on the other, a part of the records of the criminal case without ever having been used in that case, and again never returned to friends and family with the rest of his belongings. This conceptual opacity about the very nature of the diaries worsened over time precisely because of the state's penchant for secrecy and denial, and because of its determination to add no luster or detail to Casement's reputation. By 1959, the situation had become untenable. Peter Singleton Gates, who apparently had a very long life, because he was before from 1922, you'll recall, and now it's 1959, and he's back in the story. The aforementioned journalist from the 1920s had finally, after all those decades of trying, found a risque publisher who was willing to flout convention and print the text of the diaries in France. The same publisher who also offered Lolita by Nabokov. The Home Office, pressured to admit the existence of the diaries, and now threatened with their circulation in literal print, produced a series, an endless, apparently, series of internal reports justifying their release to the Public Records Office. Once the mystery surrounding the diaries is shattered, public interest should dwindle rapidly, a brief from the Secretary of State advised. To be doubly sure that no further controversies might erupt, the Home Office had also taken care to employ a leading handwriting expert who concluded that the diaries had been authored by Casement alone. They apparently expected people to accept this handwriting expertise, and then they urged in another private memo that any word of the diary circulation in the summer of 19 should be expunged from the record that was released to the public and kept hidden from view. The airing of the diaries, though, not surprisingly, did not change very much at all. In the late February edition of the Sunday Review, in 1959, Irish Senator Robert McHugh and poet Alfred Noyes dismissed the French edition of Singleton Gates's Black Diaries, published just before the original diaries were released, as old and spoiled wine in bottles. In the next week's edition, Singleton Gates pushed back, and I find the pushback to be really telling. He's a brass-knuckled crime reporter, obviously long-lived and a journalist, and he offered Casement as a very courageous man endowed with extraordinary generosity, who played a great role in his time by establishing high principles which were in dire need of such champions. But he also described Casement as isolated, as someone who didn't fit in, as a man in degenerative deterioration, who developed idiosyncrasies of various types and abandoned himself more and more frequently towards the end of his life into weakness and self-pity. Highlighting his queerness, he explained it away as pathology. We have, he proclaimed triumphantly, avoided the blind form of hero worship which has made Roger Casement, in the imagination of the Irish, a saint of purest water. Responding to criticisms that the work amounted to pornography, he dismissed that critique as a provincial antique, a relic of prudishness in Little England and Catholic Ireland, where ready-made principles and narrow-minded bigotry ruled. We contend, Singleton Gates concluded, that it is possible to be a hero in the classical sense and a pervert at the same time. Now, the posthumous policing of Casement's sexuality runs right to the present. In 1995, after Mander's postmortem examination was released to the public, one of the most eloquent contemporary members in the pro-Casement brigade offered an explanation for the prison doctor's findings. Mander, began Angus Mitchell, noted historian of Irish nationalism, surely had no real experience with such an examination, and there's little reason to believe that he could accurately discern the differences he was highlighting. A brief history of Casement's anus, Mitchell concluded, I can't make this up, could be collated from various medical records and correspondences. More specifically, he went on, the object of all of this scopic attention had routinely complained of and received documented medical support for the removal of both fistula and piles in 1893 and 1900. Casement these are Mitchell's words, not mine, Casement probed the extremities of European imperialism in sub-Saharan Africa and South America. Mitchell concluded, kind of glibly, jokingly, I struggled with the right word, cheekily, that seemed wrong too. So, was this the case of the authorities getting their own back? In his quote. His point was that no matter his sexuality, Casement's bottom was already a diseased ruin, a consequence of empire. So perhaps Mander misread what he was seeing. Once more in Mitchell's letter, we find a mythic, fantastical, dystopian notion of queer sex, as if the active homosexual anus would be indistinguishable from a diseased sore. The post-mortem inquiry performed by Percy Mander at Pentonville was, much like Mitchell's later critique of the diaries, a meditation on Casement's capacity to be both queer and revolutionary, to be an agent of civilization and a champion of the subaltern. It was meant to answer questions that could never be answered fully enough, questions that linger on in the present. Some of those questions, let's see if I can manage this, were about race and sex. There were echoes here of Oscar Wilde's case, but Wilde's predations, as British high society found them at the turn of the century, may have been distasteful and wrong, though they also confirmed a long-standing and familiar image, that of the effete intellectual and his beautiful young protege. Casement's sexual interests were unprecedented and had crisscrossed over all sorts of more worrisome racial and global lines. It was all too much that a champion of indigenous Africans and Indians, the man who stood up for them in the court of world opinion, should be revealed as an uncommon sexual predator, taking advantage of his appointment as a muckraking critic of empire to find a vast suite of relatively disposable, dark-skinned lovers abroad. Lovers who were nameless, without pedigree, so calculatingly indexed in those diaries. Lovers who were, again, on Foucault's terms, infamous. Because to give these men a name, to identify them for the record, would be to grant them humanity, or perhaps even to grant them fame. So Casement was also a photographer, and this is a photograph he took of one of his lovers in South America, which I'm going to take away. Sorry to keep this. Like Mander's effort to understand his sexuality, the Home Office's determination to erase Casement, to render him infamous on Foucault's terms, were meticulously documented. And so too were the efforts to determine once and for all whether the diaries were authentic, whether the man himself had taken a pen and hastily scribbled down the specifics of each day's improvisational trysts and planned encounters. This effort to know with certainty whether Casement was queer, but also to bury deep in the earth that certainty, once discovered, is one reason why we remember him so vividly. It's why we argue about the diaries. To close, recall that Casement's corpse was buried in an unmarked mass grave, and that quicklime was sprinkled upon it. For centuries, it was thought that quicklime hastened the decomposition of bodies. This made it a favorite of kings and murderers alike, offering the former a chance to demonstrate power over the body after death, and the latter some hope of dissolving the evidence of crime. As a metaphor for erasure, long before it was applied to Roger Casement's corpse, quicklime was both ancient and durable, used in burial rituals dating back to the Iron Age and running right up to contemporary detective fiction. As Oscar Wilde himself wrote in the Ballad of Reading Gaol, all the time the burning lime eats flesh and bone away. It eats the brittle bone by night and the soft flesh by day. It eats the flesh and bones by turns, but eats the heart away. A legendary, mythic substance associated with war and violence, it dramatically expressed power, the power after death, to blur, to dissolve, to obliterate one's victims. Contrary to urban folklore, though, quicklime doesn't actually dissolve the body. It preserves it and prevents radical decomposition. It allows for some things to be seen more clearly, for general details to outlast the intent of the application. When Casement's body was exhumed, for example, it was found to be surprisingly well preserved, not dissolved at all. Even more interestingly, and under a very specific set of circumstances, quicklime can produce an astonishing illumination, a shocking luminescence known by its staged name of limelight, a bright flash that dramatically preserves and highlights, the stuff of cinema and stage, of Hollywood and Broadway. The application of quicklime to Casement's physical remains gave the British state clarity instead of stupefaction, and illumination where it wanted only darkness. The same can be said, of course, for its efforts to lock away the diaries forever, to shift them beyond the pale of what we can ever really know or understand. That's it. Yeah, totally.
Questions? Go for it.
Do people ever say no when you ask if you're
I don't know, but I always feel like you should ask.
What if I just said no?
All right, we're done here. Get some cookies, right?
Yeah.
Give your name when you raise your hand. You can probably see better than us.
Please.
I have a really silly question. It's not academic at all. My name's Emma, by the way, but it's relevant. Forget that. It's not academic. How would people not know that lime preserves bodies? Like, just out of curiosity, if they've been doing it since the Stone Age, and then they were like, just kidding, it doesn't work.
I honestly don't know. Maybe they don't take them back up.
They just thought probably it should dissolve.
It's also true that I'm not a chemist, so this is I'm merely relating to what my own survey of quicklime and my use of it as an organizing allegory here reveals. But I don't know. I'm surprised that we wouldn't have figured that out before 1959. Yeah.
I'm Jane Arrington. How did you get into this topic in the first place?
There are many different answers to that question.
Well, let's take two or three.
I'll take 2 or 3. Right? So, first, Casement appears as a minor figure in the first book that I wrote. So I had very few people reference their undergraduate honors theses in history. Mine was about the 1916 Rising in Ireland. So I had an interest in Irish cultural nationalism, which became an interest in the Harlem Renaissance through other stories that we can talk about later. And so I had thought about him and been thinking about him for some time. 2, I also have a dissertation advisor who's very much in my life and who often tells me that I should write a book on subject X or Y or Z. And so he told me as I was thinking about what to do next after writing the biography of Josephine Baker that I needed a more clearly politicized biographical figure to put at the center of my next body of work, and named Roger Casement as the person I should return to. So remembering the dissertation. And then 3, after saying all of that, it just, at the time that I came up with the project, which is now about 3 or 4 years ago, it just felt like an incredibly pressing question, sort of a question born of teaching 18 to 22-year-olds for the last 20 years of my life, and trying to think about what inspires or motivates political passion, or what the roots of radicalism are at a moment in our history in the U.S., and I suspect here too, where histories of sexuality and lived experiences of sexuality are being dramatically overturned and rethought almost on a day-by-day basis.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
Could you fill in the people who may not know a little bit more about Casement's sort of human rights work, both in the Congo and in the Peruvian, Colombian rubber tapping area?
Yeah.
And the question that I want to rise out of this is, was he already seen as a sort of threat to empire prior to the Irish nationalism, or was it really just the Irish nationalism that sort of turned opinion against him?
That's a great question. I think the easier answer is to say no, he was not seen as a threat. In many ways, so Casement is a kind of William Faulkner figure, right? A sort of hardscrabble kid in Ireland, goes into the British Consular Service as a way to make his name and make his fortune in the world, at least as best as he can, given his life circumstance, and who finds himself moving through fairly boring ports of call, but earning a reputation for a kind of daring, a willingness to sort of go off the beaten path, to perform what we would now call something like an ethnography in dialogue with indigenous peoples wherever he encountered them, who had a knack for making personal relationships. And in the early 1900s, he's dispatched to investigate rumors in Leopold's Congo that there's some abuses happening to British citizens. And so he, in it's kind of hard to explain this as radicalism, but he has like a troop of people who follow him. He wears like white linen. He looks like Oscar Wilde Goes to Africa in a very weird way. And he goes deep into Leopold's Congo, and he unearths some horrific practices, and he writes all of these up, practices that border on, and in some cases he would say exceed slavery. So ritual cutting of limbs, punishing people by burying them up to their necks in the ground, just really gruesome practices of labor control and exploitation. And he writes this all up in a report, and then he champions the report. And the report makes the British look great, in the same way that Conrad's Heart of Darkness makes British Empire look great. And Conrad and Casement actually knew each other and had encountered each other in Africa while Casement was there as a consular agent and while Conrad was sort of dreaming up what would eventually become Heart of Darkness. So in the same way that Heart of Darkness celebrates the British Empire as the civilized version of empire when compared to what's off the beaten path. Casement made the same basic claim, that the British could hold the Belgian, could hold Leopold to a higher moral standard, and that theirs was the standard that should be followed. When abuses surface in the, just a few years after that, around like 1908, 1909, that there are abuses going, that there are similar things happening in the rubber grown region of South America known as the Putumayo. Casement is again dispatched. He's the logical person to dispatch to this place because he's already got this track record of having, produced a lengthy social scientific report that had swayed British public opinion. And the same thing is true there. What he uncovers is both brutal and horrific, but is also very easily turned into a defense of the British way of doing things. And I think privately what's happening for him is that he recognizes that he's writing reports that sanctify the British version of empire, and in his internal correspondence, he's disgusted that he's got a knighthood, he's thinking about not accepting it, he can't believe that he's being held up, and the British Empire is being held up as this kind of moral compass for the way that the world should engage the global south. So I think he finds Gaelic nationalism or Irish nationalism or radical progressive political positions at the same moment that he realizes his work is all too easily used by the British to celebrate British Empire. That period between 1908 and 1914, which is the period in which he writes the second report about the abuses in South America, the period of the Universal Racist Congress when he's sort of hobnobbing with the world's most distinguished anti-racists, the period at which he's knighted, the period at which Irish nationalism and cultural nationalism takes off in particular. This is a period of real personal ferment for him, and it's one that is deeply introspective. It's also the period in which those diaries, if we work with the 5 extant diaries, it's also the period in which his own sexuality was in flux. He was at least indexing in written form more frequently his sexual relations with men in South America and elsewhere. That's a sort of an answer to your question. Please.
Could you, maybe say a little bit more about his relationship with Du Bois?
I'm eternally hopeful that at some point I'll find like a letter that just says, like, I love your work. There's the easier thing to say is by 1915, Du Bois and Casement are basically saying the exact same thing. So Du Bois's African Roots of the War essay is mirrored by a series of essays that Casement writes about the sort of peoples of color plus Ireland being deployed in the Great War as cannon fodder, while marshals and generals celebrate to carve up the global South. And they sound eerily, frighteningly similar. So there's a section of the book where I'm actually reading those 2 essays very closely together and wondering, whether there was some sort of personal, surely there was personal contact made at the Universal Racist Congress. Du Bois's own personal memories of that Congress are all about a kind of emergent love affair with this woman that he met there who later gets dramatized in Dark Princess. And so there's less of the nuts and bolts of what I did this night and who I met, who I spoke to. It's much more about the princess, as she'll later be called. But politically and ideologically, and in terms of what they're writing and where they're putting it, they're seeing between 1910 and 1915, Casement is moving very close to Du Bois. He's almost a Marxist. And his sense of the materialist consequences of the war and their impact on the global South is precisely the same as Du Bois. It's really astonishing. Please.
Hi, my name is Ina. I just had a question about, like you mentioned something about Casement and colonial reform. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like what, how does that operate in like his own thinking? This idea of colonial. I just noted it down. But
Yeah, it's that best practices thing, right? So the reform is of colonialism rather than a British colonialism, because the problem with the work that Casement does in these two reports in particular is that they set up a universe in which the British Empire really is the best possible way of mediating between First World and Third World, or between Europe and the metropole and the global South. So the reform is a kind of public shaming, and then later, more structural corrections to the kind of abuses of empire that we see elsewhere. This is not a surprise, right? That we can point to the thing that's dramatic, physical, and gruesome, and at the same time enable more depersonalized, institutional, horrific and troubling practices over here. And so Casement's own work as a reformer is, especially when he's working for the British, is about this part of it. Like, let's identify the places in the world where the very worst things are happening as a consequence of First World and Third World interactions via empire, and let's spotlight those and seek to address them and eliminate them. But he's never really able, that's what he's trying to do to a certain extent when he's litigating on behalf of the Irish. He's never really able to get the reformist impulse present in British society to take a look in the mirror and think about what the British might be doing, both in Ireland, in India, and elsewhere.
So he himself never like tries to put the mirror back on things. Well, is what I'm saying.
No, I think he does. But he is, first of all, he returns from South America and he's deeply ill. So it's important to note that he eventually resigns his commission as a British consular agent and turns his own effort towards publicizing what we've been shorthanding here as Gaelic cultural nationalism or Irish cultural nationalism, which we would understand as something like, Ireland for the Irish, or like buy Irish things, or in the way that we think about ethical biographies of the products we consume today, the sort of economic and cultural nationalism of the teens in Ireland was very much about like only buy Irish goods. What's your Irish name? Like, so he started signing his name in a particular way, and this isn't his way, his critique of British colonialism in Ireland. And he's also keenly aware at this moment, he becomes more and more keenly aware in the same critical period of time of his own position as someone who's both Irish and white. This is a moment at which his sort of racial self gets fractured in a particular way. So he is aware that Ireland is a colony, but not a colony like India, and not colonized in the way that Africa is. And so he's looking in the mirror himself and is writing publicly about what he finds and what he learns about himself and about the British Empire. But he has less public traction, in part because the British don't care at this particular moment in time sufficiently enough to investigate these practices, and also because he's not an official agent. He was never dispatched to Ireland to write a report on the abuses of the British there, and was not dispatched to look at other British imperial projects and figure out whether or not they were successful or not.
And sorry,
No, sure.
so like what years, like, I guess like what year did he die again? Or like was he at all like operating during the interwar period? That's my last question.
No, 1916.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. He has a, as I've said, a kind of strange afterlife in that interwar period. But it's not related to the kinds of, his public image is so damaged by the backdoor circulation of these diaries that he is celebrated in some quarters. Like, so for instance, there are a number of African Americans who write on his behalf, trying to get him freed. And Du Bois himself writes a series of editorials on Casement's behalf in the summer of 1916. And he's referenced in African American political work for the next several decades. But in terms of like the progressive imagination in Europe, he falls out. Sure.
Yes, I'm Karen Lindsay. I like this a lot, thank you. I really like that you started your presentation with reference to the historical moment we're in now, and I think you said something like the cruelty and power of the state with respect to sexual politics.
Yeah.
Can you talk generally about how you use or how you frame histories like this in your undergrad teaching now? What does this do to animate or confuse current students, undergrads especially?
Yeah. Well, it definitely does confuse and animate them. What it does, you know, I think one of the things that drew me to this particular subject, we were talking about this at breakfast just a little bit, is that maybe this is true at Brown to a greater degree than at many other institutions, because Brown, as you know, is a sort of famously liberal, though it imagines itself as famously left institution, and the students who are at Brown just love the idea that there's a clear, pure political position outside of what is corrupt and tainted that they can occupy as a way to signify that they are clean and the taint of complicit political behavior is over here. And so a lot of the work that I do, specifically drawing on the work of Stuart Hall, is about challenging and problematizing this for them. And that's at the basic conceptual level, like introducing them to Hall's work, thinking about what culture is, whether there's a space outside of culture. That's also about case studies, you know, talking to them not just about Casement, but about Josephine Baker, who's another example of someone who had a kind of radical politics that students don't recognize as radical. It's also, you know, again, conceptually getting them to challenge within themselves this notion of what radical is, which they seem to imagine is only like voter registration drives in Mississippi in the summer of 1963. And if you're not wearing overalls, then you're not radical enough. This at Brown, which is incredibly ironic. And then, you know, Brown has an advisor in the whole, which means that students come to you at all hours of the day and night with intellectual questions about anything. And they have a lot of questions about politics and about their own political position. And I spend, you know, 4 or 5 hours of every week meeting with students to talk to them about where they stand vis-a-vis the political issues of the day and helping them to historicize that subject position using not just this for Josephine Baker, but just the broader pantheon of iconoclasts who stand outside of the simplistic divides they so regularly want to erect. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Rebecca Manley. I really enjoyed the talk. At the beginning of the talk, you said you were interested in this intersection of radical politics and sexuality, and we got a very sort of rich portrait of how that emerges in cases, particularly the afterlife. I mean, the moment of the trial, how these diaries are tended, are received, circulated, and how these interact. I wonder how in the broader project I mean, there were questions earlier about the evolution of his politics and his engagement with these political questions. How does his sexuality get woven into those earlier chapters? I don't know what the structure is, but into his evolution. What materials do you have? How do you approach that?
So in terms of I'll answer the question backwards. So what materials do I have? I have the 5 diaries, right? So, and those have been, those are readily available now thanks to the efforts largely of a contingent of queer Irish historians who've tried to get them to print and put them out there in better versions than the 1959 version of Peter Singleton Gates. you know, all of his letters, all of them, that are extant, because they were confiscated by the police, are in publicly available archives. So it's not, this is in projects past where I've tried to really understand a person's subject position, the collection has been curated by family members or friends. That this picture, interestingly enough, appears in a collection of photographs that the police had held for some time, but returned to his sister. And she held on to them until they could be delivered to the National Library of Ireland. But I don't know, he was a regular photographer. There are 115 photos in the image, in the collection rather, which is not a lot. So it's a spotty, and there's never a moment in the diaries where he says, like, I just realized that I'm gay and getting more radical. So, and that these two things might be related. So I wish there was. Maybe someday he'll find that, but I'll find it rather. But there's definitely, given that we have the diaries, there's evidence that some diaries were destroyed by family and friends. Destroyed by a personal friend in Belfast, who's one of his chief correspondents, and destroyed by Guterl, who also lives in the north of Ireland. So it's possible that there are records that are gone, or records that could yet be found and uncovered. Weirder things have happened. If you just take what we have, which I'm already confessing is not everything, and I would have to qualify this when I was writing very carefully. It is clear that the composition of the diaries changes as he gets more and more alienated from empire, and they change in terms of the tone and temper with which he writes about his work as a British agent, and in terms of the frequency and intensity of his sexual encounters with men. So that's a fact. It's not yet an interpretation. I suspect that Casement's radical political positions are emerging as either an after effect or a consequence of his slow and gradual coming out of the closet. Right? It's an odd. There are many concepts I need to work through as I finish this, start this, pull this together. What do we call someone who is abroad in a context where sexuality is not so viciously policed, and who might well be out of the closet when out someplace far from London, who clearly has a series of regular contacts with whom he meets often. Also, do we really call this, like a relationship? I think that's the, Roseanne and I first met at Rutgers Newark, and I'm thinking a lot of Jen Lewis's work as I write through this. Jen Lewis is a U.S. colonial historian who writes about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and there's a part of me that has really struggled with how to write about these relationships. This is an official agent of the British government in a colonial location, and also a queer gay man in the closet. So, are these equalitarian relationships? He's paying money for them, so that too adds a layer to this. It's extremely complicated not to pull this apart, and I suspect a lot of his personal political positions about empire are again a way for him to work through his realization that he is really bound up into something that is not what he thinks it is. So he might have a romantic sense of what these relationships are like, but I suspect the writing's also becoming more urgent in the diaries and more clinical and less melodramatic. So instead of saying had a dreamy afternoon with so-and-so, it's much more descriptive and mechanical as we get deeper into the period. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right. If you have a better one, please write it to me and tell me. Yeah.
Hi, Stephen. So I just to bounce off of that a little bit, I really like your discussion of the diaries, and I'm kind of a little bit fixated on it, especially when you call them like the private index of the closet. So it's kind of resonated as I think that really kind of represents like the challenge of trying to read back sexuality in the past. But at any rate, I guess you mentioned that, unless I misunderstood, that the airing of the diaries didn't change much in terms of public opinion of of him, and I'm wondering if you could speak more to why that was, like whether it was because people, like primarily because people questioned their validity, or because the impression that I got from what you talked about was that it had a lot to do with people just taking away from his story what they wanted, like whether he was a revolutionary or a pervert or an enemy of the crown, things like that. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, if you could speak more to why the airing didn't change a lot.
So I think a part of the answer is that conspiracy theories have really taken hold of the public imagination in Ireland. There are a series of beautiful book by a guy named Bill McCormick about what happens to the diaries in the 30s and 40s, and then a whole cottage industry emerges of like Irish writers who are determined to write and rewrite about the forgery effort and to turn this into a real sort of cornerstone of Irish nationalist folklore, right? That Casement's diaries have been rewritten or redrafted or completely forged or interpolated by the British. And so the public opinion in 1959 is already on the side of them being falsified, not necessarily being true. And I think that conspiracy theory, I'm calling it conspiracy theory, it becomes more, we were talking about this at breakfast too, like starting with conspiracy for the graduate students in the room is actually not a bad historical position to take when you're encountering something at first. But then you're supposed to like winnow through it and figure out, like test the conspiracy. And I think a lot of what's happened since the diaries were released is about testing the conspiracy. So it doesn't feel quite as feverish or as animated as it did in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But it still feels like people are trying to find a way to make the conspiracy work. And that a way involves more and more moving parts or ever more fanciful possibilities. I mean, it makes, it also just seems animated by a kind of latent or implicit homophobia that I just don't really understand. The stakes of this seem peculiarly Irish, whether or not Casement was clear that the diaries were forged. From one of the perspectives of coming at this question from a US or hemispheric background is that I have no real problem accepting the diaries as legitimate. I mean, I've seen stranger things in the course of my time writing, so I can't imagine that this is an uncommon habit for someone of Casement's education and training, someone of Casement's introspection, and someone with his voluminous writing habit. I mean, this is the guy who writes everything down, so of course he's going to have a little diary where he writes his stuff down.
And I think for us as academics, like it's a really interesting way to read like kind of queerness and sexuality into like power relations of empire and the impact of race and his, in particular through his relationships with like racialized bodies and things like that in the global south. And so like it's just has a lot of potential to kind of hash out some of these relationships, I think.
I think tellingly, like you all know the Bechdel test. This is like a test of cinema, like do two women talk to each other about something other than a man. This is how you know that a film satisfies the basic conditions of feminism. So Casement's diary doesn't satisfy any kind of test here. Like we hear nothing from these people. So there's no like walked on the promenade, talked about, I don't know, lunch, and then went back to my room. Like there's none of that. So there's no sense of even conversation, not even a brief reference to dialogue. It's all physical and mechanical, and that too adds to the complexity of writing about this.
And the power dynamic too, the power difference between himself and the folks he had relations with.
Yeah, completely. Please.
Hi, my name's Peter. I've just got a question about how, especially during Casement's time working for the British Crown, how is he perceived in Ireland? And what impact does do those perceptions, whether they're reported publicly or sent to him privately, what impact do they have on him in his development as kind of a radical or an Irish nationalist?
Well, his route to personal, it's not personal wealth, but his route to like financial stability is not uncommon, right? So it's not, Ireland is a colony, the British employer, biggest employer in town is the British government, even if it sends most of the Irish away from Ireland to do it, either as soldiers or as consular agents or as working for British businesses or something like that. So there's nothing unusual in the work that he does on that sense. That people would have recognized and understood that being as tightly tied to Britain as Ireland was, there's nothing wrong or shameful about having done this work. And he locally is understood as a real patron of the kind of Gaelic language revitalization effort, which is really a bellwether of Irish radical politics in this moment in time. So he adopts in private correspondence his Irish name very early on for the period of time. He works with Douglas Hyde, who is basically the anti-colonial activist on the spot for Ireland from 1893 onward. He's heavily involved, if somewhat abstractly connected to the Irish Republican Brotherhood's planning of the Easter Rising. He wouldn't put him at the center of Irish revolutionary politics by any means, but he's not at the margins either. He's not like William Butler Yeats, for instance, who had to litigate or maneuver through some of the same sets of complexities, but who was at the margins of radical politics in this moment in time. And Casement's touring, when he's not abroad, he's in Ireland touring the country, offering, he's famous, he's offering opening speeches at new Gaelic schools that are opening up. He's working fundraisers to help raise money for Gaelic nationalist causes. So he's a hero. A part of the challenge of his legacy is that he's from Northern Ireland, from north of Belfast. And so the land, the territory that he was most closely connected with is now cut off, as you know, from the other counties in Ireland. There are parks in Belfast named after Roger Casement. There have been statues erected to him there. Most of those have been blown up. It's an odd place to go, actually, Belfast. That answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you. Please.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm really interested in the work you're doing with the lives of infamous men. The essay, The Lives of Infamous Men. And in that essay, I think one of the things Foucault's doing is historicizing the notion of infamy in 16th century, 18th century French history. I'm wondering, by the time you get to Casement in the early 20th century, do you historicize infamy? Does it have a different texture, a different kind of political balance than we would see in, say, in Foucault's sense?
Yeah, it will, I hope, when this is done. So this is an abbreviated version of what I think is a far too long epilogue to the book, which oddly enough was the first thing I wrote, not the last thing. So there are all sorts of bad practices going on here. And there's an extended section which I'm still really not happy with, in which I really chronicle the way in which the government and the Metropolitan Police collected, organized, and cataloged all of Casement's personal belongings, which to me feels like a storyline that's ripe to read through Foucault. And then how they dispersed that archive and rendered it depoliticized in the context of doing it as a supplement to this particular work here. So I hope that in the, I hope not even more full version of the epilogue, that I can talk a little bit more about the specificities of fame and infamy and celebrity in this particular period of time. I'll have to say that that particular essay was not something I encountered in graduate school, and it's only something that's come to me lately. I co-taught a class with a queer studies scholar at Brown on passing and trans. And we put that essay at the start of the class, and I have kept coming back to it and revisiting it. It's an amazing piece of writing and thinking, and not something I encountered until I was, old enough that I needed more than 16.5. But thank you. I will make a note to myself that I need to redouble my efforts to do that, to historicize infamy for this particular moment in time. And I think the Wilde case is going to be hugely important as a prologue to Casement's own trial and to the discussion of what fame, infamy, celebrity might have meant in 1916, because it's referenced too often. Some of the same legal players repeat and the end game is very different. It seems like the legal team has learned strategies from what went well and what went poorly in prosecuting Oscar Wilde, that they try to do better. In the case of Casement, and better here means giving less room for his image to grow. Does that make sense?
It does, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Matt
Thank you,
for
guys.
a really great